Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and it's time for another tale from Olde Sussex, from Philip Mercer's Tales of Olde Sussex, published in 1834. And this is the story of the Rackham rats. It concerns a miller called Josiah Payne and his father Edmund. They had a windmill just west of Billingshurst near Crozier Farm. And they milled in this farm, or in the windmill, for some time. It was a dilapidated old windmill that they rented. And one of the problems of having a windmill is rats. They're attracted obviously to the grain and of course to the flour. And unfortunately, one time when Josiah was young, his father inadvertently locked him inside the roundhouse at the bottom of the post mill. You have the post mill on top, and then you have this enclosed roundhouse in which the trestle of the windmill sits on. And Josiah was playing as a youngster, inadvertently got locked inside the roundhouse for many hours in the evening, and became aware of the rats that were running around, which crossed over him and nibbled at him. And it gave him a psychological fear of rats that lasted with him for the rest of his life. His father, Edmund, also wasn't keen on rats at all, and in fact, one rat had spooked him when, after a gale, and Edmund had been on top of the windmill putting back some of the wooden planks that had got blown off several feet above the ground at the top of the windmill. A rat had come out of a little cubbyhole somewhere and had scared him, shocked him that he'd slipped, fallen from the windmill, and if it wasn't for the sweeps that he managed to grab hold of on the way down and broke his fall, he could possibly have either killed himself or broken his back. As it was, he damaged his leg and hip and was unable to walk terribly well from there on after. But he was still able to continue his work as a miller. So rats were not a favoured thing with these two millers. Time went past, and one day a notice was sent, an eviction notice was sent to the windmill, and the landowner, who was an absentee landowner who had concerns in London and Liverpool, probably to do with merchanting, although Philip Mercer doesn't elaborate on that, wanted to sell the land as well as the windmill that it was on. It was a dilapidated old mill, and the mill was going to be pulled down. Well, Edmund, who had been working all his life as a miller, and being a miller was a pretty well-paid job because everybody wanted their grain milled, obviously, and bread was made from flour, and so farmers would pay to have their grain turned into flour. So there was a bit of money that Edmund had made over the years. But the landowner was not selling. He wanted to sell all the land, and that was far too much than Edmund could afford. So Josiah and his father Edmund scouted around the locality and looked for another suitable mill. They did find one, but it was at Rackham. It wasn't a windmill, it was a watermill. A bit dubious. They went and had a look at it. Again, it was another dilapidated, in a bad state, hadn't been operated for many years, but that was really only the exterior. When they examined it more closely, they found the wheel, the water wheel, was actually in pretty good nick, and the internal mechanics and the grinding, the milling stones were in good nick, as well as all the other mechanics that required on the inside. It was really just the roof and some of the walls and cosmetic, really. And so they thought they would make a go of it. So they paid the money and got hold of the freehold, and were quite happy with that. The water came from, I suppose, he doesn't really say, but in Rackham it must have come from the Downs, a stream. There was a mill pond which would then have provided enough water and power to turn the water wheel. There were some other industries further upstream, which they didn't really know about at the time, and the farm. But they were quite content that this would make them a living, and so they bought the freehold, as I said. One of the problems it was, once they got up and running, of course, were rats. But not only your ordinary rat, and of course other rodents as well, but water rats. These were much larger than ordinary rats and would get in all sorts of nooks and crannies, no matter how much they tried to secure the place, putting down traps, poison, using feral cats or even dogs. Still didn't get rid of the problem of the rats. So it was a big issue for them. And one day Josiah was bemoaning this problem to the local farmer he met, who was walking his fields adjacent to the mill pond. And he said we have this problem with the rats. And the farmer said, "Oh, well, why don't you pay the rats off?" And Josiah looked at the farmer and said, "What do you mean?" And the farmer said, "Well, the previous tenants, when they were here, they used to pay the rats off. They would stand at the end of the mill pond and take a penny and throw it into the pond and make a loud statement, 'Here, rats, here's some money, be gone.'" And Josiah looked at the farmer thinking that he was a little bit mad. And said, "Well, I don't think we'll be doing that, thank you very much," and returned to the mill. But back in 1762, when this story takes place, people were quite suspicious, and he did wonder how they got rid of the rats. And this idea of paying off the rats stayed with him for some time, until eventually he thought, well, it's not going to hurt, is it? It's only a penny. So he threw this penny into the pond, into the mill pond, where the farmer had said, "Hey rats, here is a penny," threw it in, "be gone." And he went back to the mill and he waited to see if this would make any difference. And a few days went past and there seemed to be absolutely no difference whatsoever. And he thought, well, this is very silly. But it played on his mind so much so that he thought he would try it one more time. And as he went to the pond, he saw the farmer, and he said to the farmer, I've tried this, it didn't work before, I'm prepared to give it one more go. And the farmer said, the previous tenant used to throw the coin in once a week. It was a weekly occurrence. Pay the rats each week and they will disappear. And Josiah thought, well, they haven't gone so far, I don't see why they would go now. But he went through with the ritual. He held up the coin, he called out to the rats, "Here is a penny." He threw the penny into the mill pond and he said, "Be gone." And he went back towards the mill, passing the farmer one more time. And the farmer said wryly, he said, "Well, of course, if you really want to speed it up, you could double the amount and throw 2 pennies in." And Josiah looked at him and said, "That is ridiculous." Anyway, he returned to the mill, and curiously, over the next few days, there was a diminishing in the rats. He did notice there wasn't as many, and the following week he went back up to the end of the mill pond, and this time he took 2 coins and he threw them in, doing the same old ritual. And there was the farmer watching him, and he said, "It's working, isn't it?" And the miller said, "Yes, how did you know?" He says, "Well, didn't you see all the rats, the corpses of rats floating in the mill pond last week? There must have been at least 2 dozen. He said, "Really? 2 dozen? He said, "Yes, it's working. It may be superstitious nonsense, but it's getting rid of the rats." And Josiah looked at him and thought, that is amazing. And the dog that liked swimming in the mill pond was running around. He said, "Yes, my dog chases them. He can never catch them, but he doesn't need to now, for they're all going. Well done." Josiah went back to the mill quite happy, and over the next few weeks he noticed that the rats were in fact disappearing, to the point that there were no more rats But each week he went out and he stood at the end of the mill pond, and he took these 2 pennies and he threw them into the mill pond, saying, "Rats, here is your pennies, be gone." And this way he got rid of the rats all the time, no problem. And it went on for years, this ritual, weekly throwing the coins in, and he was happy. And Edmund, the father, was also happy. There were no rats and they could carry on and do their milling. Well, time is a funny thing. Before you know it, it has crept on, and 10 years had passed. And in that 10 years, Josiah had met a young lady in the village, and he had married, and he had his own son, who was now 4 or 5, running around, helping in the mill, and occasionally would go with him to the end of the mill pond and throw these coins in and say the magic words, "Here is your money, be gone." One day the little child came running up to Josiah when he was milling, and he said, Father, you must come with me. You must. I must show you something." And Josiah, who loved and doted on his son, said, "Very well." He asked his father, who was now quite old and quite decrepit, to just keep an eye on the machinery whilst he went with his son to wherever it was his son wanted to take him. And his son took him to the end of the mill pond, which had now grown up with lots of lush bushes and was very lovely. And the son crept into some bushes and said, "Father, come in here. We must hide." "Hide?" said Josiah. "Whatever for?" He said, No, wait. I will show you." And they waited, and not a lot was happening, and Josiah was getting a bit agitated, worried about his father looking after the mill, and he was started to think he'd better go back. Then all of a sudden the boy said, No, there, look." And Josiah looked, but all he saw was the farmer coming with his dog, walking up around the fields and standing on the edge of the mill pond, completely oblivious to the fact that the miller and his son was in the bushes. And Josiah whispered to his son, "There's nothing unusual on seeing him. He often walks past here." But the son said, "No, wait." And then suddenly the farmer lifted his arm and clicked his fingers like this. And the dog leapt into the pond and started to swim around in the middle. Then the farmer clicked his fingers a second time. And at that instant, the dog dived under the water and was gone for several moments. The farmer looked completely at ease with the situation. And then the dog re-emerged from underneath into the surface of the water and swam back to his master with something like a black mass in his mouth. Josiah thought it must have been a rat. But no, this black mass was placed into the farmer's waiting hands, and Josiah could see that it was almost like a wet clod of earth, silt or mud or clay. And the farmer was searching through it with his fingers until eventually he found a couple of items in this clod of earth. He took his hands and washed them in the mill water until whatever it was gleamed in his hand, shiny, gleaming. And then with one of them, the farmer flicked it up into the air and caught it. And Josiah looked, getting more and more angry, his face turning red, for he knew exactly what the farmer had taken from the mill pond. Well, some time passed, a week, 2 weeks possibly, and all of a sudden the landscape around the mill was full of people running, dashing, madly panicking. They carried pails and buckets and all sorts of strange containers, saucepans even, anything that could carry water. And they ran to the mill pond and they filled up these things with water, and they dashed back towards the threshing barn of the farmer. It was a new threshing barn. Josiah had watched it being constructed over the summer. It was ablaze. Fire was coming all over it, which was a shame because It had only just been, there'd only just been the harvest, and it was full with hay. And now it was all on fire and smoke. And no matter how hard the folk from the village and everybody filled up their containers and went to try and put out the fire, it just was not enough. The fire was too intense, and the barn burnt down and collapsed into a heap of chars. The only person that didn't go to help, for unknown reasons really, was Josiah, who watched everything from the top of the mill. Some time later, the farmer was forced to close the farm completely. He was now bankrupt. He packed what little belongings he seemed to have onto the back of a wagon and left. It was curious because it was only a couple of days before Josiah's own father died. He'd been ill for some time now, and the crippling of the fall had caused him all sorts of problems, including things like pneumonia and various things. And it was on the cards. People knew he was going to die. And so there was the funeral. And the farmer couldn't make the funeral because he had left, but many of the other folk who knew Edmund came and paid their respects at the funeral, including one gentleman that Josiah didn't recognise at all. And this gentleman lingered until everybody else had gone after the wake, and came back and approached Josiah, and he said, "Hello, I thought I ought to introduce myself. It's silly, I should have introduced myself to you, over 10 years ago, really." He said, "I knew your father and he was a good man. We occasionally had a drink in the pub, but we never really spoke much. And I wish I had seen you, but I was afraid to speak to you." And Josiah said, "Why so?" He said, "Well, when you took on the mill those 10 years ago, we were looking at the tannery just upstream. And we know that we can be very unpopular because the substances that we use in order to make leather in the tannery, urine and dung, is quite repellent and repugnant, and a lot of people don't like the smell. You probably could smell it going through the mill race and through the mill." And Josiah hadn't really paid much attention to the smell of that, for he was very busy with his milling. But he said, "Interesting, 10 years ago you set up at the same time as us. Tell me, the substances that you use for making leather, what do rats feel about it?" "Rats?" laughed the man. "Rats? Oh, they can't stand it. We never have any problem with rats. In fact, anyone downstream of us for at least a quarter of a mile, you'll never see a rat." "Oh, really?" said Josiah. "How very interesting." And there you are, another story from the master storyteller, Philip Mercer, in his wonderful book. I hope you enjoyed it. I will no doubt try and find another one and relate it to you soon. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on another video. Till then, bye-bye, bye-bye.